Rajiv Jhangiani is a faculty member in the psychology department, as some of you already know. He runs the Open and Innovative Pedagogies Lab. He serves as a senior open education research and advocacy fellow with EC Campus. He's also a faculty workshop facilitator with the Open Textbook Network, and he's also an associate editor of Psychology Learning and Teaching. When people ask me which instructor I would recommend for a psychology class, I never fail to mention Rajiv's name because honestly, he is one of my favorite profs here at KPU. So I'm very grateful to have had the privilege of taking the Psychology of Genocide class with him a few years back, which is why I'm very excited to have him here and to share this experience with you. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani.
So I should confess, before I became a faculty member, I spent about 15 years in a professional dance company, so being on stage with lights is very comfortable to me. So that's a bit of a warning as well. You did the house lights as well, fantastic. But I also confess that because I love engaging in this topic, I'm not going to stay on the stage. So it's also a fair warning to the people working with the video cameras. I will be moving quite a bit, I hope that's okay. So thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And it's funny because I feel like I know your family through classes I've taught. Yeah, even your sister took a class with me. So anyway, but thank you for coming, and I know there's food at the back, and people just free to help themselves. Please feel free to help yourselves to pizza, and I won't take that personally. Just don't lob it at me. So this is a little awkward because I have to work two different things. I'm going to switch that up. This is a topic that matters a great deal to me, and over the course of the next 40 or so minutes, I'll give you a sense of why. I'm hoping that we will have a fair bit of time for questions and a bit of a discussion, especially at the end. So I usually give a longer version of this talk, but I'd like to preserve some time. In case you're wondering, or maybe I should ask, does anyone identify the image that's at the backdrop of this title slide? Go ahead. It is a concentration camp. This is the end of the railway at Auschwitz-Birkenau. I had the privilege of visiting there late last year as well, and I'll talk about some of that experience along the way. But when I talk about the psychology of good and evil, this has a lot to do with the course that Amanda mentioned, the psychology of genocide. It's a fourth-year course that I sometimes offer here at KPU. But before we talk about good and evil, I actually want to talk about very ordinary things, very boring things. So I want you to start by thinking about this environment. And I imagine you've been in this particular situation a few 100,000 times by now. Yes? Straight up social psychology, you walk into an elevator, what is the experience like? It's awkward. Do you prefer to be alone in an elevator like me? Yeah? Everyone tells us we're a social species, right? And I'm a social psychologist, so I will reiterate that. But it's really interesting that when you're in this confined space with other members of our species, that we're really uncomfortable. So we walk in, if you're like me, you get in there, nobody else is there, and you do that extra sort of placebo button of let's shut the elevator as soon as possible before anybody else can come in. And of course the elevator doors close. But if somebody sneaks in, puts their hand, there's like a portion of you that dies in that moment because you really wanted to be alone. So anyway, they come in. Are you making eye contact with them? Random conversations? No. You are? Excellent. Usually there's three sort of modal options. One is look at your shoes, two, look at the door, three, look at the numbers. That's basically here, right? And as soon as you get there, of course, people leave. But this is an example of a very strong social situation. It's not explicit. It's not like it has explicit rules, like a job interview or a funeral where you know that there are rules about how you behave. You don't break into laughter and start dancing at one of these events, or both of those events really, unless it's kind of the job I had. Or for that matter, even in a job interview, somebody asks you what are your weaknesses, you know what the answers are supposed to be. It's not at all truthful. When you say rubbish like I'm a perfectionist or some bland nonsense, that's not a real weakness. So you know this. So this is an elevator, you walk into the elevator. The next time you go to an elevator, in fact I want to invite you to purposely wait for somebody else to come in, a group of other people to come in. And as soon as the doors close, all you have to do is turn around and face the back. The whole ride up, and I promise you, if you want to see how powerful the social situation is, you will feel how uncomfortable you're making them. It's fantastic. And as soon as you get there, they will escape from the mad person. It's brilliant. So an elevator is a very powerful social situation. I'm talking about this because it's ordinary. Another example of an ordinary situation, this will work. Yes, it will. Maybe. Why don't you just looking back and forth? Here, this is you, clearly, at the end of my talk. Right? But imagine you're at a performance, a play, a concert, something like this. And if you go on opening night, you should know that the first 24 rows are basically stacked with family and friends of the performers. And right at the end, they will all leap to their feet and deliver a standing ovation because it's their child on stage. But as more and more people stand up, you're thinking in your head, that was okay. It wasn't great. But as more and more people stand up, you feel this pressure. I need to stand up. I need to start giving them a standing ovation too. Part of you thinks, no, I'm going to resist. But eventually you're going to stand up because it's just going to feel so damn awkward. Right? If you've been in this situation, you cannot. And then there's this. Another example of an ordinary situation where you're crossing the street. Let's say you get to the end, press the button, you're waiting for the walking sign, and you're the first person there. A couple minutes later, there's another few people who come behind you, they see you waiting, they see the hand is up, they wait as well. 3 more people come, they wait as well. Now, essentially, you're leading a group of people. It's like you're a beaver holding up a dam or something. It's amazing. So all this social pressure that's built up. Imagine there's no cars going either. So there's no actual logical reason other than some social contract we've maintained to follow these rules to stop. But you've all stopped. Because the fact that you've stopped makes it more likely that other people behind you will observe the same rules. But then you know what's going to happen, right? Somebody's going to come from the back and they're going to do this. Right? And as soon as that happens, you know exactly what's going to happen as students of psychology. Right? All that pressure is built up, it's released. So all of a sudden, everyone's crossing the street. It's fantastic. And that shows you the paradox of my field, social psychology. Where that example is one in which you can see the power of the situation, yes, but also the power of the individual, one person to modify the situation for everyone, if that makes sense. And so there's many reasons why I'm talking about this stuff. Even examples like this. Somebody cuts you off in traffic and you get really upset, right? Words start flying, fingers start waving. And if you know about the fundamental attribution error, of correspondence bias, you'll know why. There's an immediate assumption that the person who drove badly because they are a jerk, because they are inconsiderate, because they are a bad driver. The assumption is not immediately, oh, they must be rushing to the hospital for some sort of emergency. We know this, we make these kinds of attributions. And I'm talking about all of this because in general, we know from social psychology that we tend to assume certain things about the world. We tend to assume that people's behaviors are caused by factors inside of them. We tend to assume that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Now, of course, that's just a fantasy, and I hope you realize that by now. Right? There's lots of wonderful people who are suffering from any number of horrible conditions. I'm sure there are child molesters who won the BC lottery for that matter. Right? So we know that this is a fantasy, but that's still what much of our culture, much of religion tells us. And so I wanted to stop and ask you about this word. And this is why I'm going to stop talking for a little bit, because this is a big, loaded word. It means many things to many people. It's overused quite a bit. But I want you to think about what this means to you. And if you think it's possible to look at an individual, a person, and label an individual as evil, I'd love for you to raise your hand. If you think it's conceivable that in the whole of human history, you can point to at least one person and say, you know what, that person was evil. Maybe put your hand up right now. But you've all taken social psychology. I'm glad to see some hands going up. It's amazing that so few hands go up. This is definitely a group of psychology students. Usually you ask people out there in the real world, civilians who are not psychology students, then they'll say, oh yes, yes, yes. And you ask them who? Who do you think they would say?
Hitler?
Pretty much. I mean, he's like top of the list for most people. But we could bring things home quite a bit, right? We could talk about the Robert Pictons of the world. We can talk about other people like that. But evil is such a loaded term, it almost loses meaning. So I want to look at how our culture describes evil for a moment. So here are some examples from popular culture, from let's say popular film over the last 100 years or so, of how evil has been depicted on screen. See if you recognize these examples. Fair representation? at least from Hollywood. So, Dracula, Freddy Krueger from the Nightmare on Elm Street series, Wicked Witch of the West, Lord Vader, and of course, He Who Shall Not Be Named. Yes? Fair enough? All evil in their own way. But what else do they have in common? That's my question. Not all at once. Go ahead.
They don't start off evil.
They don't start off evil. That's a really interesting to pick up on. Yeah. So this goes back to this notion of, Lucifer not just being Satan, but essentially being a fallen angel. Right? That's a really good point to pick up on. Another one? What else binds them? What do they share? What do they have in common? Amanda?
No monster.
Yeah, none of them are human. Right? That's really fascinating, and that's what we continually tell ourselves. Dracula, clearly not. He died. Definitely not human. Certainly not. Vader is interesting, right? Because the only time I think he relates as human is when he's literally and figuratively unmasked. So the message actually from popular culture is this, is that evil is something that's perpetrated by monsters, by those that are not human. And now when you think about the Robert Victims of this world, what is the popular explanation? Oh, he was a monster. It's the same thing. It's the assumption that evil is something that's perpetrated by monsters. And the trouble is, as a social scientist, you don't have to explain that. If evil is performed by monsters, you don't have to understand evil, because monsters, by definition, do monstrous things. But social psychology has a lot to say about what leads people to perform these kinds of actions. So I want to say that there's two problems with this. One is, by saying that evil is perpetrated by monsters, we don't allow ourselves any room to explain the behavior. And B, we also distance ourselves. Because if we say that evil can only be perpetrated by monsters, clearly you don't think you're a monster, which means you think this is not something you could ever be capable of. So there's a self-defensive reason over here as well. So let's here talk about a real monster. And even as a social psychologist, I had a little problem with defining somebody like this as evil. So this is Rudolf Hess. He's the commandant of Auschwitz, the concentration camp I showed you a picture of earlier. And when he got to Auschwitz, when he was put in charge of this concentration camp, which was essentially a killing camp, he decided he wanted to make things more efficient. And I have to warn you, when I teach the psychology of genocide, I tell my students on the first day, this is not a subject that is politically neutral. It is not something that is emotionally neutral. I can't talk about the psychology of good and evil without talking about what humans have done. So this is what he did. When he got to Auschwitz, they were murdering people already. But they were murdering people by firing squad. And if you go to Auschwitz today, you can go to the wall. You can see the fragments of the embedded bullets. You can see how they were doing it, where they were doing it. But for him, that wasn't efficient enough. So then he decided, no, there's a war on, we need to conserve bullets. So they put together as many heads as possible of prisoners. And they used a single bullet to see how many they could kill. Because that was more efficient. But then he realized that's still not efficient enough. So then they invented gas vans, where they would put 40, 50 people in the back of a truck, drive around for 20 minutes, routing the carbon monoxide into the back. 40, 50 people, 20 minutes. But then he thought that still wasn't efficient enough. And then of course they escalated to gas chambers. 200 people, men, women, children, stripped of their clothes, stripped of their worldly belongings, even their hair shaved because that would be reused. The fillings from their teeth extracted because that would be repurposed as well. And of course sold under the pretense that they're going into a bunker where they're going to have showers. But of course those shower heads were never going to be used. That's the firing wall. That's the entrance to one of the gas chambers at Birkenau. And what happened is when 200 people walk into this chamber, they shut the door. And if you think about concepts like diffusion of responsibility, they explicitly made it so that not one person was responsible for this. It was a whole set of people. It was important that no one person felt the psychological sense of responsibility. Makes it easier. So one person somewhere else, and that person didn't have to see or hear what was happening. One person pressed a button. That button released a gas canister. The gas they used was a gas called Zyklon B gas, which is a heavy gas. And so the horror right now is realizing that the heavy gas, it starts at the bottom and it works its way up. You have to realize who dies first. And as people are struggling to get away from the rising gas, sometime later you essentially end up with a pyramid of bodies. And the worst picture I've ever seen is a picture that is not of blood and gore. It's a picture inside this chamber of lines. And these are not just lines. These are people trying with their bare fingernails to claw out of concrete. This is the kind of terror, this is the kind of pain that I hope none of us can ever even understand. And, not even in theory can we understand what this is like. But this is what human beings are capable of, and much, much more. And when you talk about leading Nazis and the study of evil, it's not just Rudolf Hess, the fellow at Auschwitz I was talking about, but it's this man who's a central figure. This is Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was a minister in charge of a few things, but also the transportation network during the Holocaust, during the Shoah. And it was really through him that whether it was Jews, political prisoners, others, Jehovah's Witnesses, different groups that were persecuted, homosexuals, if someone was deported from their home to a ghetto, he was involved. If someone was deported from a ghetto to a concentration camp like Auschwitz, he was involved. So he was directly or indirectly involved in the murder of millions. And because of the way the Holocaust was run as an industrial machine, paperwork in triplicate. Evidence is overwhelming of his involvement. After the war, he managed to escape Europe, which is rather interesting. He took on an assumed identity. He pretended his name was Ricardo Clement. And the International Red Cross didn't realize that they were assisting him leaving Europe. He fled to South America, took on an assumed identity. And it was years later. Now the State of Israel has been founded. Their secret service, the Mossad, is given a few tasks, one of which is tracking down some of the leading Nazis who evaded capture, who evaded trial. And of course, he's really at the top of the list. And it's years later, they get reports that someone who looks like him is living in Argentina. So they put together a team, they fly to Argentina in the middle of the night without the permission of the Argentinian government, which I can tell you caused a few problems. They kidnapped him, took him back to Israel, and they gave him what he never gave any of his victims, which is the benefit of a full trial. And it was during his trial that, and this is him on trial in Jerusalem, that an American political philosopher whose name was Hannah Arendt went to interview him. She wanted to understand his mindset. She thought, well, if what he's done, if what people say he's done is true, those actions are surely evil. And she wanted to understand the kind of person that's capable of evil. So she interviewed him at length. And of course, he was eventually found guilty because the evidence, as I said, was overwhelming. And in fact, he remains the only person put to death by the State of Israel in a trial of this nature. But she wrote a book after the event called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And the subtitle of the book has, in some sense, become synonymous with the book itself. A report on the banality of evil. And that phrase is really important in the study of social psychology. To be banal is to be mundane, to be ordinary, not unusual. And she was saying that evil itself was banal. Why? Because she said he was just an ordinary person. He was just a cog in a big industrial machine. He didn't seem like a passionate, sadistic murderer. The only thing she thought he was passionate about was his ambition, his career. And she thought if he's capable of evil, well then everyone's capable of evil. That was essentially the thesis of her argument. And we can debate whether she was right or not about him. I personally don't think she was right about him. Because Eichmann is an example of someone, when he was given a direct order by his superior to use his trains to transport supplies to the Russian front, where the Nazis first started to lose, he directly disobeyed that order and instead shipped 200,000 Hungarian Jews to their deaths. That doesn't strike me as someone who's ambitious and just following orders. But even if she's wrong about him, she's maybe not wrong about the thesis. This is something I hope you're all familiar with by now. In the study of social psychology, there's a few studies that are often pointed to when people are trying to understand why people like Eichmann might blindly follow orders. So this is the advertisement from Stanley Milgram's study on obedience to authority. And if you know about this research, please just raise your hand so I can blitz faster. Excellent. So you'll know about this. This was not a study with college students, right? They explicitly looked for people from the community. There was deception. They didn't tell them what the study was about. You know all of this. And you know the punchline, right? Roughly what proportion of people, ordinary people, went all the way to 450 volts on this machine? What proportion? I'm hearing 80. It's a little bit lower than that, but it was about 68. So about 2/3, just over 2/3. Which itself, if you'll pardon the pun, is an experiment that shocked the world. To think that perfectly ordinary people would be willing to harm a complete stranger just at the behest of somebody in a white lab coat who says, I will take responsibility, please continue. Just verbal pressure is sufficient. But if that's the overall message of Stanley Milgram's study, is that it doesn't matter who you are, we can all be swayed by someone in authority to perform actions that would be regarded as atrocities by others. That's not the full story, because Stanley Milgram had 18 different versions of his experiment. And if you dig deeper, you'll see substantial differences. So here's the machine, and I'm showing this to you just to illustrate how long it takes to go from 15 volts all the way to 450 volts, ignoring all of the verbal warnings that are on it. Even after receiving a sample shock, even after hearing blood-curdling yells, pleading, talking about a heart condition, people still being willing to go all the way. But not everyone. This is the typical condition. The one you've probably seen in a video clip of the Milgram experiments, the one that's taught in a typical intro psych, social psych textbook, right? 68%. But there were other conditions. Consider the one in the middle. In one of his experiments, participants were told, well, yes, you have to test them, you have to see what they get right, what they get wrong. But when it comes to a shock, you do have to give them a shock. But here's the machine, it's entirely up to you which level of shock you administer. They could choose anything from 15 volts to 450 volts with 15 volt increments. They could choose. And they could even repeat the same one over and over again if they wanted to. Those were things they couldn't do in the typical condition. And so when people had free choice, what happens? The level of shock, you go from 2/3 or just over 2/3 of people harming a stranger to that extent to just 2.5%. This is the same experiment in every other way but that one instruction. So if your message from Milgram's study is that an ordinary person is perfectly capable of this kind of atrocity, maybe not. You have to consider the situation, you have to consider other factors. And then, of course, one other condition, this is experiment 18, in fact, where there was not one person pushing a button, but there were two. So there were two teachers in that version. The real participant was just reading out the words and checking to see if the learner on the other side of the curtain was getting the words right or wrong. And there was a confederate, an actor, who looked like another participant. And it was that person's role to actually press the button. So this question is not what percentage of people press the button. This is what percentage of people were very comfortable being part of a system that delivered a shock, as long as they were not the person pressing the button. And in that case, it's 92.5%. And that's the variation that's masked. So what I'm trying to suggest over here is, yes, the situation is important, and I think this condition conveys that. But if you vary the situation, you're seeing a number of other things shine through, and it's not just about the situation. One of the factors that interplays, that interacts with the situation, is, of course, personality. Right? And even as a social psychologist, I'm never going to underplay the importance of personality, of those stable traits that interact with the situation. One of the factors, there's a few, even in Milgram's study, that predicted which participants were more likely than others to go all the way to 450 volts. One of those factors, authoritarianism. That's actually a constellation of different personality traits. It's got a number of things in it. One of them is a rigid obedience to authority, which in this study makes a lot of sense. Another is the tendency, the proclivity to treat someone who disobeys you or who breaks the rules very harshly. So you can see how this sort of reinforces the behavior in the study. But we can go from liberal study to another unethical study in the history of psychology. Yes? How about this one? Another one that starts with an advertisement in a newspaper. This one looking not for ordinary people, but college students for a psychological study of prison life. You remember Phil Zimbardo's Stanford prison study. And please don't call it an experiment. It's not an experiment. It doesn't have a control condition. Right? And of course, if you know about the Stanford prison study, you'll know that it was meant to last up to 2 weeks, but only 6 days in they had to shut it down because the behavior of the guards against the prisoners was incredibly sadistic, it was very aggressive, it was torture in many ways. Right? Sleep deprivation, being made to forced to eat food thrown on the floor, being forced to clean toilet bowls with their bare hands, constant torture. Again, person by situation. A study in 2007, in fact, they took the same advertisement that Zimbardo used in 1971 for the Stanford prison study. They published it, but they published 2 different versions of it. One said we're looking for male college students for a psychological study of prison life that will last up to 2 weeks. Same text. The other version said we're looking for male college students for a psychological study that will last up to 2 weeks. The only words omitted from the second version, prison life. Now, I'm not suggesting that male college students are representative of the general population, because they're not. And I'm especially not suggesting that male college students who can spare 2 weeks magically in their life, I'm assuming they're unemployed, are representative of the general population. Right? Or for that matter, that males are representative of the broad spectrum of humanity. But even if you just look at these 2 groups, the words prison life led to different people signing up. And the people who signed up for the study about prison life were dramatically higher on authoritarianism, once again. And even if you look at the study itself, there were 12 guards and 12 prisoners, if you remember. And again, assuming you've taken introductory psychology at the very least, this is a study that at some point will be familiar to you, I hope. Of the 12, turns out not just 1 or 2 dropped out early, but half of them, 50% of the prisoners, dropped out early. And if you look at the scores on authoritarianism of the prisoners who dropped out early versus the prisoners who stayed until the 6th day, the major difference, authoritarianism. The correlation between how long participants spent in the prison and their scores on the F scale, which is how you measure authoritarianism, is 0.898, which is near perfect correlation. The people who stayed in the study longer were more than 4 times as high on authoritarianism as those who dropped out. So again, it's not just the situation, it is also personality, it is the interplay between the 2. And so with that in mind, let me come back to the question of mass violence. Because ordinary behavior is the foundation for extraordinary evil. And that's why I'm talking about studies like this and examples that are even more mundane. The stages of genocide is a way to analyze mass violence. You look for commonalities across different events, whether it's the genocide in Rwanda, Armenia, the Holocaust, or anything that's gone on since, anything that continues. We start with classification, and this will remind you of social identity theory. So if you're targeting an outgroup, you need to be very clear who is us and who is them. In the language of social psychologists, who is the in-group, who is the out-group. This is typically something that's done very, very early, including through propaganda. In Nazi Germany, for example, this is one example of hundreds of posters that depicted the in-group. So you can see us. Who's us? Well, Aryans. Tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, strapping, salt of the earth. That's us. But you notice with stereotyping that there's always sort of convenient subtyping that goes on. There's always exceptions. So even if you come up with an example that's contrary, it's not going to affect how people think, not going to affect how people use their stereotyping. So of course, it should be obvious he doesn't really fit the stereotype of the Aryan, but of course that doesn't matter. And he wasn't really German, he was Austrian, but that doesn't really matter. You know, short, black hair, dark eyed, physically unimpressive, high pitched, squeaky voice. But leader of the Aryans, okay. But they had to make it explicit, so they passed the Nuremberg laws, where they said, let's make rules about who is us, who is them, who is a Jew, who is not a Jew. And what's fascinating is they had this obsession with blood and how Jewishness is something that's passed on through blood. So there were, for example, imagine if your grandparents converted from Judaism to Catholicism, as another example. Your parents were raised as Catholics, you were raised as a Catholic, you would be in a concentration camp because Jewishness is part of your blood. They were genuinely bishops of the Catholic Church who were labeled as Jews. So, the old sort of joke about, is the Pope Catholic? Maybe not, if you're a Nazi. So here's the rule. If all of your grandparents, all 4 grandparents are Jewish, you are very, very Jewish. If 3 of them are Jewish, you're still Jewish. You can see if you have 2 or even 1 of them who are Jewish, they call you Mishlinga, which is almost reminiscent of the Harry Potter term mudblood, mixed blood. And then finally, my favorite, if none of your grandparents were Jewish, you still may or may not be Jewish. It's interesting. So it starts with that. But once they've labeled who is us and who is them, we have to symbolize it in a way that's evident. In Rwanda, they passed a law forcing people to not just, forcing people to carry around identity cards that had their tribal, ethnic, loyalty or affiliation stamped right on it. It's not something that was a big deal until the Belgians made this law, the colonizers. In Nazi Germany, of course, same thing with the patches on the arm. The Yellow Star of David for Jews, and of course there was an assortment of others depending on which other category of other you fit into. So we have to symbolize it, so at a distance we can see who you are. Another example, you move down the train, you start with discrimination, and discrimination starts small. The first law that was passed was prohibiting Jews to sit on park benches. And if you live in 1930s Germany, or if you live in 2018 United States of America, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, does it? Of all the things you hear about, all of the words, all of the races, diatribes, you think, well, that's all. That's not so bad. I can accept that. I can rationalize that. But that's not how it ends. It escalates. It starts with things like travel bans, sitting on park benches. It escalates. It escalates through dehumanization. Dehumanization is a very effective, long-standing use of propaganda. And this is important because we've already talked about us versus them, in-group versus out-group. This goes further than that. Right? Imagine if you go to school, all of your textbooks describe a certain group as not just them, but as not human. This is why in Nazi Germany, Jews were described as bacteria, as bacilli. This is why in Rwanda, the targeted Tutsi population was referred to as cockroaches, for example. You see this across different genocides. It's explicit dehumanization. So this is a poster depicting the out-group in the context of Nazi Germany. And I've shown you lots of propaganda from the in-group. There's another one. Quite the contrast between the Hitler Youth, or the girl version of it, and the out-group. It goes on. Right? This is us, clearly. And this is them. This is dehumanization. And you hear this, as I said, in your textbooks, from your teachers, from the doctors, from the police. One of the things that happens during genocide is what the scholar Gerard Ullman referred to as the shattering of the assumptive world, which means that in normal life, you assume that if you need help, you can go to some people for help. In your community, you go to judges, you go to policemen, you go to lawyers, and so on. People who you could go to assisted professions. But in genocide, these are often the professions that perpetrate the worst harm. You can't. It shatters your assumptions about normality is the issue. Right? Dehumanization. You look under a microscope, what do you find? Bacteria, stars of David. That's the idea. Very effective. And so this is what it does. Instead of just us versus them, which is social identity theory, in-group, out-group, us is good people, of course. Them is other people, like the British, like the Americans. If you're a Nazi, for example, yes, they're people, but they're not good. They're on the wrong side of history and all of that. But dehumanization is adding a third layer, and that's the point of not people. That's the critical bit. And after being inculcated with this for decades, you're forced to, mandatory service in the army, everything is pointing you in the direction of being able to press that button when you're part of the machine in that gas chamber. That's the power of dehumanization. It doesn't happen overnight. And so I do want to try a small exercise with you. Imagine right now, as I'm talking, there's a mosquito that just flies into the room. Okay? I don't like mosquitoes. So I take 2 steps out of my way, I smash it with my hands. I've killed the mosquito. And I'd like you to tell me by a show of hands if you think I've just done something unethical. Good. Reasonable people with me. Thank you. There's ones that a good chunk put their hands up, which is problematic. But let's take it up. It's not a mosquito. Let's say it's a cockroach. Right? Mosquito, I can say it's going to bite me. Maybe it's carrying some sort of virus. A cockroach is not going to bite me. It's just disgusting. Yes? But I take a few steps out of my way, squash it, and kill the cockroach. Unethical? I like you guys. No hands so far. Okay. What if it's a rat? A rat enters this room, and I pick up some piece of equipment, I don't know, like a trash can, and I fling it in the direction of the rat. And just with spectacular accuracy, I hit it on its head, and I happen to kill the rat. It wasn't my intention, but I killed the rat. It's lying there bleeding on the carpet. Unethical? Really, even though I didn't intend to. I've lost some of you. Okay, fine, be like that. What if
Only because you didn't intend to, though, I mean.
Okay. Rats? Really? What if it's a cat? Incessant mewing, and I lose it, and I go and just twist its head. Yeah. Unethical? I lost everyone. Okay. So what's clear is that somewhere between a rat and a cat, I lost everyone. And we could genuinely spend 20 minutes talking about squirrels and guinea pigs to figure out exactly where your moral boundary is. But you have a boundary, is what I'm trying to establish. Outside of that boundary, same rules don't apply. By all means, massacre all of them. Inside, no. I'm glad I didn't talk about dogs. Maybe that would have been worse. But this is the point. That is dehumanization. From then on, you go to organization where the infrastructure is created for the genocide to actually occur. This again is something we've seen. Organized. There are always instigators. There are always way more people perpetrating than there are people organizing. There are always people organizing. Polarization takes even the discrimination further, where you don't just discriminate in terms of laws, but you actually physically separate them from the rest of the population in various ways. We can talk about our own treatment of Japanese Canadian citizens, for example. But we can certainly look at the creation of ghettos during World War II. Preparation is the stage just before the killing. And of course, then it continues. The killing begins really with persecution that's sporadic. In the case of the Holocaust, it was Kristallnacht, known as the Night of Broken Glass, where it starts. And the start of this kind of violence is really critical, because what's really happening is the instigators are waiting to see what the reaction of the general population is. And if the general population doesn't say anything, doesn't react strongly enough to the persecution, that's when it ratchets up. That's when it goes to extermination, via things like gas chambers. These are very explicit stages, and you do see them in every genocide in human history. But it doesn't end with killing, because after the killing, of course, they add insult to injury by denying. Denying that it occurred, denying that it was as widespread, denying that it was as systematic. You see this every day. You still see this. The government of Turkey is a good example of a nation that continues to deny the genocide of the Armenians, a genocide that the Canadian government has officially recognized. And of course, in Nazi Germany, it was a similar thing. Persecution to extermination is a critical step, as I said. With them, they didn't start with the extermination of Jews. They started with a program called the T4 program, which was really the forced euthanization of the physically and mentally disabled. There was a huge outcry, so they stopped it. But when they started persecuting Jews, nobody spoke up. So they didn't stop. This is a really good case study. And I promise I'm getting to the end. But with the Nazi doctors, as I said, these are people who you would normally go to for help. These are not people who were natural born killers in that sense. They had to be socialized into killing. And you see evidence of this. This is a book in which you can read interviews with these physicians after the fact. And you can see how they had to do it. In the beginning, one of them wrote, it was almost impossible. There was a heavy use and reliance on alcohol for them to carry out some of their experiments. And of course, eventually, it became almost routine. It was socialized into killing, much as a participant in Stanley Milgram's experiment doesn't feel comfortable when they hear a person yelling. They turn to the experimenter. But with enough pressure, with the right forces, yes, you can get 92.5% of them to do that. They're socialized into it. Right? And you can justify it. This is what the scholar Irvin Stau refers to as the continuum of destruction. That if you start with small steps, you can eventually get much, much further because the range of possible actions that are normal to you are different. In Stanley Milgram's study, the buttons were 15 volts apart. So imagine you've done 15 volts, 30 volts, 45, 60, now 60. The next one is 75. Is it really easy to say, you know what, I'm going to stop now because 75 volts would be unethical? What, 60 is that far from 75? It's really hard when they're that close, when the steps are that close, because if you've justified 60, you are now the person who's comfortable shocking at 60. So shocking at 75 is not dramatically different. So that small increment is actually part of the design. So you can start with something that you think is immoral. But if you start doing this long enough, you can start to justify it. And that's exactly what the Nazi doctors did. First, they couldn't do it. But eventually they started to rationalize, you know what, these inmates at the camp are going to die anyway in the gas chamber. We may as well further knowledge of science by using them and abusing them and torturing them. You can justify it. But what's interesting is down the continuum of destruction, you end up with a reversal of morality. And the reversal of morality is that what was initially immoral, which became justifiable, then becomes a moral imperative. Which means, over here, you'd be immoral if you did the action. Over here, you'd be immoral if you didn't do the action. And that's the reversal of morality that you see. So people can become fanatical murderers. Ordinary people can become, not just, I did it, I could justify it, I was forced to do it. No, fanatical. But in talking about all of this, I want to lay a set of parallels rather quickly. Because if we're trying to understand what it takes for an ordinary person to become a mass murderer, what may be far less obvious is that these same psychological processes are often underlying the behavior of the best of us. Not just evil, but good. Heroic actions. So, we've talked about what's effectively known as moral exclusion, which is kind of like dehumanization. Right? The people who you're targeting are outside of your moral universe, for example. So you exclude them from the normal rules of morality. Right? We've talked about, certainly in psychology, you've learned about destructive models. That if you observe people who you look up to, who carry out antisocial actions, you're far more likely to adopt those, especially as a younger person. We've seen charismatic leaders persuade people, right, with populism, to rise to leadership positions, to get people to do things via conformity. We've seen group norms. There's people at Nazi rallies who were not there because they believed passionately in Nazism, but because all of their friends were there. They were the people who were in the crowd, forced to stand up, doing a standing ovation. This is perfectly normal stuff. I've talked about the continuum of destruction and how it can end in fanaticism. So now I want to quickly give you the parallels. Imagine people who risk their life and even the lives of their family members to save the life of a complete stranger. That happens a lot, especially during genocide. You see the worst of human nature and you see the best of human nature. But what makes them tick? Moral inclusion. It's actually the same process, it just depends on how you draw the line in the sand. Take King Christian X of Denmark, man on the right, basically said when the Nazis invaded, Denmark is unusual. Most countries in Europe had the majority of their Jews murdered. Denmark had 93% of their Jews saved. of reasons that happened is his leadership. There's a legend that says that he said when the Nazis passed the law about the Star of David, the patch, he said, if my Jewish citizens have to wear the Star of David, I will wear the Star of David. We are all Jews. Turns out he didn't actually say that, but it would have been nice. But that's what he espoused. So defining themselves by nationality, not by ethnicity, was critical. And that's how ordinary Danish people gave up their boats, their fishing vessels, and managed to get the majority of Danish Jews across the water to neutral Sweden almost in 24 hours. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens through a lot of trust and a lot of leadership. That's moral inclusion. Instead of destructive models, you can have helpful models. And especially if those people are charismatic, you can even use things like conformity to get people to do the right thing. Small village in France, Nazi-occupied France, called Le Chambon. This is a group who was led by the man in the middle, a Protestant, a minister, and the village went to him as their leader, as their moral leader. What should we do? And he told them, if you're going to be good Christians, you need to save all of the Jews in our village. He defined it that way. He was charismatic, he was their leader. I'm sure there were people who hated Jews in that village, but they did it. It doesn't matter if they do it for the right reasons. They did it. So they hid the families with enough food and water in the forest behind the village. And every time the Gestapo came to see to arrest the Jews they had on the voting records as living in that village, they were not there. They survived. These are all the children who survived because of his leadership. These kids grew up and had kids. Their kids have had kids. And then, of course, just like you have the continuum of destruction, you have the continuum of benevolence, which weirdly, as it is to put it up here, can lead to fanaticism. So imagine you're just, average Wilhelm walking down Berlin in 1930. You're Aryan, you have nothing to do with this. There's a person running down the street towards you with a panicked look on her face. You don't see anyone behind her, but she's running. And as she goes around you, she says, breathlessly, don't tell them where I'm going. And you have no idea what she's on about. But sure enough, a couple of minutes later, there's a troop of SS officers coming down the road. And they stop you and they ask you, did you see anyone? And you don't have 3 hours to think about this. And later on, you even wonder, like, why did I say that? And in the moment, for whatever reason, you say, no. Doing that makes it more likely that you will agree to look after the possessions of a person who's being deported. Doing that makes it more likely that you will agree to hide someone in your attic, like Anne Frank was. Doing that makes it more likely that you go further and further, and that is the continuum of benevolence. Your initial actions determine the range of potential subsequent actions, is what we're talking about. And when we talk about fanaticism, here's one of the most famous rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust, Oskar Schindler. And you've seen the movie Schindler's List, read the book. And Schindler, if you look at the list of people, who's going to be a moral beacon? It's not him. This was a guy who is a card-carrying member of the Nazi party. He's a war profiteer, he's an alcoholic, a womanizer. You think, yeah, probably not him. But he did. He saved some, and he saved more, and he saved more. And when he was arrested towards the end, which he was, he broke down. Because he realized in that moment, I could have sold my car and saved one more Jew. That's a very dramatic transformation for a person who started what he did. But it didn't happen overnight. Same thing with Paul Rusesabagina. Maybe you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda. Again, another individual. Individually saved 1,200 Tutsis from murder during the Rwandan genocide. His biography is called An Ordinary Man. It's hard to stomach that. Somebody who's made those kinds of choices and think of them as ordinary. But that's how he thinks about himself. Here's the striking parallel. If you interview perpetrators, like Nazi perpetrators or other genocides, why did you do it? What do they say? I had no choice. I was just following orders. If you talk to bystanders, people who didn't do the killing, who were not the persecuted, but didn't actually speak up or do anything, what do they say? You have to accept it. There was nothing you could do. You couldn't do anything. They have to justify that. And then you talk to and interview rescuers, during genocides. What do they say? I have to help those in need. There is no choice. Well, of course there's choice. But it's really striking. It's another parallel. So as controversial as this sounds, again I'm going to say the psychological processes that underlie our behavior are often the same. What's different is the content of our actions, but the process that underlies it is very much the same. And that's a striking thing. Between the best and the worst of human nature, it's not different types of processes, it's the same process. And so I'll finish with two things. One is, this is one of my favorite images. It's from the graphic artist M.C. Escher. And to me, it's a lovely illustration of human nature. Because you can see the demons in this image. And if you switch how you're looking at the image, then you'll see the angels. Because they both exist, because the same psychological processes very often support both kinds of behaviors. The structure is the same. And so labeling monsters as such, just as that's not helpful, labeling heroic actions as unbelievable, superhuman, I couldn't do that, that's also unhelpful. This is a very famous poem written by a pastor, Martin Niemöller. He's a Protestant minister who opposed Nazi policies and eventually ended up in prison because of his opposition to Nazi policy. He wrote, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. And of course, then they came for me, and then there was no one left to speak out." We could easily update this for 2018, right? First they came for the Muslims. Next they came for the Mexicans. Or perhaps first they came for the indigenous people, quite frankly. We could easily update this. How many categories do we not fit into? How long until it's us? This is the question. And even though in many cases we think that these are things that don't happen over here, we should know better. You may live in Canada of 2018, which promises to be the beacon of egalitarian, equal treatment of humanity in the world. It is not. This country is deeply racist. Deeply. This is part of our history. This is here. Keep Penticton White, that's between World War I and World War II. The internment of Japanese Canadian citizens in our neighborhoods, New Westminster, just across the bridge. That's our history. Okay. This is our history. The Komagata Maru, the Continuous Journey Act, racist piece of legislation that made it legally impossible for a person to immigrate to this country from South Asia. Except at the time there was no vessel that could come here without stopping at least once in between for supplies. Illegal. We know about the Chinese head tax. This is part of Canada. This is as Canadian as maple syrup. This was Canada's official policy for Jews during World War II. None is too many. They wanted no Jews. There were boats full of Jewish refugees from Europe. We denied them. We sent them back to Europe where they were murdered. That's part of Canada's history. Now we continue to treat indigenous people in this country. There's a lot of people who talk about truth and reconciliation, but there's little truth, and reconciliation is something that we are comfortable leaving to indigenous people instead of doing ourselves. The work belongs to us. The last residential school closed in 1996. In your lifetime. This is not old news. Right? But I don't want to finish on a heavy note. I want to finish with a real example of hope. You see, I have several friends who are survivors of the Holocaust. They were children, of course, during the event themselves. I worked with one of them for a long, long time. This is not his story, but it's the story of his aunt and uncle. So they were from Hungary, and they were musicians. And they were traveling in Turkey when the Nazis invaded Hungary. So they knew they couldn't go back. So they tried to figure out where in the world could they go to escape. And of all the places, they found the destination that was safe in India. Okay? But to cross from Turkey to India, they had to travel overland through China. World's a bit messed up. China is occupied by Japan at the time. Okay? So Hungarian musicians going to the Japanese embassy in Turkey requesting a transit visa to cross over Japanese-occupied China to get into India. And the consulate says, sorry, I wish I could help you, but I'm forbidden from helping anyone to enter an enemy territory. Because of course India was occupied by the British at the time. The world's really fun at this point. So they were denied. They said, I'm really sorry, I know what you're asking, I know how important it is, I wish I could help you, but I can't. Then he said, however, if I were going to issue you with a transit visa, here is the stamp I would put in your passport, and will you please excuse me as I go to the washroom for 10 minutes? I'm not making this up. My friend's uncle reached across, he stamped their passports, they made it, they survived. I said at the start, there's this paradox of social psychology. There's a lot of things that provoke our behavior in a particular direction that make it very difficult to do anything different. But remember, the paradox is that the individual has the capacity to alter the situation of everyone. And that's the message I would much, much prefer to leave you with. So I'll stop there. But thanks very much for listening, and I hope you have some I'm putting this up just in case you want to tweet me or email me afterwards. But we can run around with the microphone. I would love if there were not just questions, but comments. Thank you.
I have a question. So you said that there was a predictor for perpetrators, which is authoritarianism.
Yeah.
So were there any predictors for people who would do the opposite, personality-wise?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a number of things. So there's the flip side. So low scores on the F scale, so effectively low organism. There's a few other things. So it's also low end of several subscales. Typically in psychology, I'm sure you know, we've adopted more of an approach trying to study what's wrong with humans. And positive psychology is relatively new. So there isn't as much research sort of uncovering what ticks the best of us, what makes the best of us tick, or the best of human behavior occur. So if you look at things like, there's a constellation of personality traits called the dark tetrad, which is subclinical psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and sadism. Low end of those scales. Yes, there are scales measuring pro-social tendencies. And the other piece is a quality in which it's an element of empathy. But empathy has different elements. It has a sort of cognitive element, which is your ability to take the perspective of another person, and then it has an emotional element, which is what you might call compassion, for example. So those are all sorts of predictors. But yeah, so those are some of the things. But again, with positive psych, it's an interesting thing. You get different kinds of predictors for different types of behaviors. And if you're talking about the sort of there's a guy called Larry Walker at BBC who did a lovely study of people who've won this, I forget what it's called, but it's some national award we have for courage and bravery and service and all of this stuff. But he calls them moral exemplars. And depending on if we're talking about sort of heroic actions versus sort of service-oriented, pro-social actions, you get interesting differences even by gender, for example, which you can probably easily predict. Right? It's sort of big, flashy, running into burning buildings. That's very much a male thing to do. The sort of very hard, everyday, painstaking service is much more of a female thing to do in terms of predictors of moral exemplars in this country. But but I think many of the predictors are similar. Those are some of the ones that distinguish them. Anything else?
I'm wondering, like, if, I guess in terms of like Ruth Norris was talking about people like standing up in the crowd, not conforming like that, also would be a factor.
Yeah, so the question, in case you didn't hear, was about group norms and about essentially blending in, standing out, and we're going to touch on some cultural psychology over here a little bit as well. It can help, it can hurt, it really sort of depends. It's interesting, you look at elements like that, certainly with collectivism, for example, historically you would look at the research about the desire to fit in, and that's something that can drive negative behavior. It can drive the concealment of true emotions. It can certainly also drive pro-social behavior. It sort of depends on what the situation is. This is also true with de-individuation is another area that does the same thing. Classic example is, imagine a large group of people all dressed the same, all looking the same, things sort of standing upright situation. You can add in a few factors. But the tendency to perform antisocial behavior increases because your self-awareness goes down and your sense of individual responsibility also goes down. Hey!
Sorry.
No worries at all. It's always nice to be surprised by former students.
I was intending to be here, but I couldn't.
It was a happy accident.
See ya.
But even with individuation, you can point to the standing up riots, you can point to football hooligans in different places in the world. You get 3,000 people walking through Stanley Park wearing pink t-shirts for a walk to stamp out breast cancer. They're not smashing car windows. It really, there's a number of factors that can drive it in that direction or not. But as far as I've seen anyway, even though there's been probably the earliest research on this kind of mass violence concerned the wisdom of crowds effectively and so-called mob mentality, there doesn't seem to be literature for this kind of behavior. But yeah, thanks for raising that. That is another factor I think that can be harnessed in either direction. I know we have to look for another 8 minutes, so hopefully we can get at least one more question and then we'll chit-chat before we leave. Sure, please.
Just a comment. When I was in high school, I listened to talks frequently where every year by a man who survived the Buchenwald concentration camp, and he would always mention that when they got out, it was American soldiers that came to them, and there was one African American man there, and all the children would flock to him, and he would tell us that I remember looking at him and thinking that I had seen an angel, because it was the German soldiers that were prosecuting against them and had made his life hell. And this African American man came in and he just was like, I need to be with him. He doesn't look like the people that I've seen.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Do you remember the name of the survivor who came to your school?
I don't remember either.
No, unfortunately, that's a population that obviously, as you can expect, is dwindling, so it's a really precious resource to be able to interact with them. But yes, I think there's a number of things that stand out for me whenever I interact with survivors, and that's a powerful story. Another one, though, is just how, when you ask them about what helped them to survive, I think we often think it's courage, bravery, psychological strength, resilience, the sort of stuff that we want to assume. But it's luck. Luck. Just luck.
There was a woman that she was nasty to everyone in the camp, but if a child went near her, she would see them food. And
Yes.
she had that kind of
She's
face
notorious.
on.
She was called the bitch of Buchenwald. More horrific than you can imagine. She had lampshades made out of inmates' skin.
Oh,
Like, this is sick. This is this woman.
no, I was talking about a woman who was trying to save the children. She
Oh, never mind.
kind of-
Totally different. Never mind. Cancel. Worse.
You're talking about, but yeah.
Yes. I just want to go back to this question of luck for a second. So I think this is something, again, none of us choose, the context in which we're born, what we look like, these kinds of things. And I think, again, there's an automatic assumption of internal factors driving things. Sometimes, if you were lucky enough, like my friend, to be he was Jewish, but he was blonde-haired and blue-eyed. So he was able to, much more than other Jews, pretend not to be Jewish, hiding in the open, as terrifying as that is. Like at any moment you can be found out. Another example, you're at a camp, and sometimes they would ask for volunteers. And sometimes the volunteers were taken out back and shot. Other times the people who volunteered were taken out to work, and everybody who didn't volunteer was shot. And they purposely did this to make it unpredictable. So the sort of mechanisms that they use were psychologically informed. And we've seen this even in recent history. If you look at the United States, its work in terms of the capture and torture of civilians without the rule of law, without due process in places like Guantanamo Bay, which is very much a separate moral universe as far as Americans are concerned. They think, what's happening over there, same rules don't apply. This kind of stuff is very much psychologically informed. That's why the American Psychological Association has been heavily sanctioned, because they were complicit. Members of the APA were complicit in the torture of people at Guantanamo Bay, for example. So the knowledge that you're gaining, even about things like diffusion of responsibility, the factors that sort of lead to these actions can very much, at some point, lead any one of you to be someone who perpetrates these actions. So even though this is a sort of haunting note to end on, I do want you to be careful, not simply assume that we're talking about the other, what other people are capable of. But this is very much what you and I are capable of, given the right, or if you want to put it this way, the wrong circumstances. So I hope you take this in a more personal, reflective sense, instead of the easy sort of defensive rejection that this applies to other people. So I think if that's what you take away, I think that's a better service than any kind of happy message to you. But thank you for raising the example in the first place, and once again, thank you for inviting me. And I know even though we're losing the room, I'd love to chat with anyone, any number of you after this, if you have the time. But again, thanks for making the time to come.
Thank you for helping us, being our first speaker in the KPS Speaker Series.